so back to this. What could possibly go wrong, right? Problems. So England starts having a population boom. More food, more people. And until really recent history, this was true. Pretty much anywhere around the world. New food sources, uh, better crops, better farming techniques. We usually saw an increase in human population. Look up Thomas Malthus if you're ever really curious about that. But anyways, um, problem. More people. People don't like being naked. People wanted clothing. Also, early imperialism, we started to see bigger demand from other places, English colonies, other European colonies too, but especially England's going to be a world leader in imperialism. We'll talk about that later. But there's a bigger demand overseas for British made cloth and British clothing. And so this is causing problems. And as our population of the world, especially England right now, is starting to boom, we've got to fix this problem. So the obvious answer, right, is just make more clothes. But it's not that simple. Traditionally, clothes were made in a very slow, very labor intensive way. You have to understand that for most of history, once again, men would go out of the home. They would do the hunting, then they would do the farming, whatever it took, whatever time. Maybe they'd work in the skilled trades as history, as time progressed. But women would stay home and do all of the cooking, all of the cleaning, all of the child rearing, and then also be required to make all of the clothing for the most part. That's a big task. That's a heavy task to ask for anybody. And so women used to have to make clothing by hand, and this is how they used to do it. The way they used to do it was basically taking cotton or wool or whatever, usually wool in Europe, but cotton from India if you had access to it. Um, and the first thing you would do is try to clean it. Wool, if you've ever seen a sheep in the wild, they're disgusting. They're covered in, you know, feces, mud, whatever. They're not white fluffy things like you see in commercials. So a sheep is a pretty gross animal. So the wool needs to be washed and then it needs to be carded, which is this process of basically brushing it out. You're trying to get all the bugs and all the mud out, and you're also trying to straighten the strands of hair. That's going to eventually give you a bunch of clumps. If you have cotton, you'd think cotton would be easier, and maybe in some ways it is, but cotton, at least until the early 1800s, was really hard to use because it was full of little seeds and had tiny little seeds that also had to be cleaned out in a very similar way. So once again, very labor intensive. So anyways, now you have your little clumps of stuff. Next thing you need to do is basically make a snake out of it. Like you've made a Play-Doh snake before. You take all these clumps, and you could do this with cotton balls if you wanted to experiment with it on your own. But you take all these little clumps, and then you turn it into a snake, essentially. But the snake is going to be kind of, just wadded together and hold together by friction. It's kind of a big fat wad of, stuff here, all this, interconnected threads. So the next thing you need to do is start applying a little bit of tension to it. And you can pull it and kind of twist it, and I'm sure it takes a lot of practice and a lot of great technique. But eventually, you're giving tension by running it around a wheel, you will start to basically get a thinner thread. So then once eventually you have your thinner thread, you have a spool of thread, you're still not done. Then, I don't have any pictures for this, then the next thing you do is you have your thread, well then you need to intertwine them, you need to weave them together. And if you look at any of your articles of clothing, pretty much anything, especially anything made out of cotton or wool, if you look at it, you're going to notice that it's basically just interwoven patterns. That's what you're going to use a loom for. Once again, now you've got your threads, you've weaved them together. You're still not done. Now you've got your fabric loomed together, and this has taken hours and probably weeks, if not months, of work already. But now you've got your fabric. The next thing you need to do is cut it and put it in your pattern, cut in it, and then sew it together, and then finally you have clothes. This is a lot of work. As a result, most people would own 1 to 2 sets of clothing, unless you were fabulously wealthy. And most of your clothes were hand-me-downs. You would get it from your older siblings, you would get it from your parents. When somebody passed away, you would basically inherit their clothing. If something got a hole in it, you would patch it. If something was stained, you just wore stained clothes. If you were fortunate enough, especially if you were more middle class, you might be lucky enough to have a set of clothes that were just for Sunday, your Sunday best. But most people would have one set of clothes that pretty much did them their entire lives. Let your imagination work on how often they washed them. So this old way was very slow, incredibly labor intensive. It was all done entirely by hand. So next thing, this labor intensive system, this is the next thing that they would do with it to make it work. And this is called the putting out or domestic system. For most of history, if you were a farming peasant, you got to remember, you only worked seasonally. You only worked when you could farm. You'd plant in the spring, you would tend the crops all summer, and then in the fall, you would harvest all the crops. But then what would you do for most of the winter? For a lot of history, at least European history, right? A lot of European cultures did nothing so much in the winter times, except try not to die. You know, cut firewood and basic survival stuff. Probably a lot of hunting, but you couldn't do farming, right? And that was the primary industry. There were not a lot of other options. It's not like you could go work in the city or something. There were no jobs. So for a good chunk of history, people would stay at home with their families, oftentimes drinking, and we see a big drinking alcohol culture in Europe, probably as a result of this, because alcohol helps make you feel warm. It actually doesn't make you warm, but it'll make you feel warmer, and basically is an easy source of calories and a way people would preserve their grains and other things as alcohol, any excess products. So we see that culture develop in Europe. It doesn't sound exciting, right? 5 months sitting in the dark trying not to die with your family in like most likely a one-room house. So, as an option to make, peasants would oftentimes make clothing. They would oftentimes sit together in their entire families all winter long, and they, every generation would sit and work on the clothing. Merchants would come from the major cities. They would bring bushels of cotton or wool or whatever, and they would bring it out into the countryside, go to the peasant villages, go to the peasants' houses, drop off the raw materials, and this is why we called it the putting out system. They're literally putting out things into the remote areas. And they say, you guys work on this. All right, we're going to come back. Here's the patterns. These people in this example, they're making clothing for the British military. They're making army officers. But they would sit and they say, okay, you guys work on this. You make the clothes. And then I'm going to come back in the spring. I'll pick up all the finished clothing and I'll pay you for it. This was a win-win situation. The merchants got clothing made. They would be able to take it back to the city to sell or fulfill a contract for the military, and the peasants would have something to do with their time. They would be able to get some extra income that they otherwise would basically be just sitting around trying not to die. So the putting out system, or domestic, because people are working in the home system, was the next best way. But this system is also incredibly slow. Imagine if you placed an order for a pair of pants and you could pick it up in 6 months. That's essentially the system they had with the putting out system. It's not a great way to make clothing. It's maybe a little bit more efficient than just having mom make everybody's clothing, but still we're slowing down. And remember, the populations are growing at this time. We need to make clothes and we need to make them faster. So we've got this problem. So as a result, textiles are going to be the first area that's going to be transformed by the Industrial Revolution. And the why is pretty simple. Everyone needs clothing. More population equaled more demand. And also during this time period, we see a huge boom right around 1800. We see a huge boom in cotton. And a big part of that had to do with American slavery, unfortunately, and the invention of the cotton gin, which we'll talk about later. The old system was very slow, but now we're having all of these new advantages happening at the same time. There's an influx of cotton, there's going to be an influx of machinery, and all of a sudden we're going to see a lot of things changing. The textile, and by the way, textile is just a fancy word for clothing, the textile industry is going to be the first one to industrialize, and we'll talk about the early machines next.